Hi, it's me. Welcome back to yet another Limbus Company new ID overview. This week introduced Intervalos 6.5-1, Time Killing Time Bonkers, and brought along two new pieces of strong Tremor support with it. We have a new Triple Ought ID in Corp Class 3 VDCU staff Outis, and a new VAV ego for Meursault in Crushbound Past. Both are actually very solid new support, with Meursault's new ego being the better of two generalist options for the VAV slot on Meursault. I'm going to do something slightly different for this one and actually go over some status effects that already exist in greater detail this time around, since I haven't spoken about them in great detail yet, and they are pretty integral to the new kits this time around. With that being said, let's not waste any more time, and let's get into their kits. First off, it's time to go over Corp Class 3 VDCU staff Outis, whose kit relies very heavily on the Borrowed Time status effect. Borrowed Time is a very odd status effect to play around. While its count is at 2 or more, the unit gains haste and clash power up, and fragile next turn equal to 1 less than the count, which makes it the unit very fast and good at winning clashes. At the end of the turn, the count reduces by 1 and the potency increases by 1. At 1 count, it will expire and you instead gain double the potency as bind on the next turn. It will also expire if you would gain more bind than haste at any point, and if it expires in that way, the unit will also be forcibly staggered. Outis herself also gains 1 final power while she has Borrowed Time as long as her passive is fueled. She's an incredibly good clasher just in general as a result of this. She also has the same effect as the other two Corp IDs in Golden Time, where they gain a once per encounter boost of HP if they end their turn within a certain HP range, which is meant to compensate from the fragile they gain from Borrowed Time. Her support passive is also decent, allowing the fastest ally to deal 10% more damage to staggered targets. Anything that just increases damage is pretty good, so it's a decent support passive to bring if you're not sure what else you want from Outis specifically. Outis gains Borrowed Time through her defense skill, Borrowed Time Microcavity. It's a 3-13 rolling sloth clashable guard with a single unbreakable coin. It grants 4 Borrowed Time at turn end, and the effect activates at combat start, meaning it's very easy to utilize. This skill also displays that this is a self-Tremor ID, granting a very small amount of Tremor count to self as well as the target, but gaining more without inflicting to the target if it loses the clash. It being Sloth is helpful for a good amount of Tremor, passives, and effects, so it's a really solid defense skill to reliably fall back on, especially early on in a fight. Prepare to Collect is a 3-11 rolling blunt pride skill with 2 coins that can become a 3-13 if the target has 6 or more Tremor. It gains a small amount of Tremor count and inflicts a small amount of Tremor count, and there isn't really much say about it other than it's actually along the weaker end of skill ones that have been introduced recently, but since she can clash with her defense skill, it doesn't actually hold her back very much. Corp Microcavity Module is a 3-18 rolling blunt sloth skill with 3 coins that can become a 3-21 if the target has 6 or more Tremor. It also gains a small amount of Tremor count, but is also the most interesting part of her playstyle. The second hit can reduce the Tremor potency of the target if it is high enough in order to apply Tremor count to both Outis and the target. Before you freak out by that, it's the same amount of Tremor potency the skill would have inflicted by that point, so it's a net neutral overall. The third coin deals 60% extra damage if the target has a Tremor amplitude other than the default, and also causes a Tremor burst if the target has 3 or more Tremor count. If the target has the default Tremor, however, it will spend 3 Tremor count to trigger amplitude conversion into Tremor Chain, which lowers enemy clash power by 1 for every 10 Tremor potency, up to 3 clash power down. Chain is typically regarded as the worst Tremor amplitude, so it not applying to targets who already have another Tremor type is actually pretty nice, but I don't want to understate that 3 clash power for the entire team is a really valuable bonus, especially early on into an encounter, and the skill itself fully fuels the cost of its own effect. T-3 Collector Mace Max Activation is a 5-17 rolling blunt lust skill with 3 coins that can become up to a 5-23 based on the target's Tremor and gains 1 clash power if the target has bind. It gains up to 60% more damage if the target has a Tremor with an amplitude as well as if they have Time Moratorium, and always grants violent collections after the first use during an encounter. The first hit inflicts and gains a good amount of Tremor count as well as inflicting bind, and the second hit triggers Tremor Burst. The third hit consumes all Tremor count on herself in order to gain up to 5 coin power and 100% extra damage, though getting more than about 50% damage is a little unrealistic for this ID. If she has borrowed time, she triggers an additional Tremor Burst with this coin, as well as inflicting Time Moratorium. The skill also removes borrowed time from herself, effectively bypassing any negative effects it might have down the line, and since you can always just get it back later, that isn't too bad of a deal. Violent Collections is an effect that persists for the entire encounter. It grants up to 15% damage if Outis is faster than her target, but also makes it so that she gains 1 additional tremor count from her skills if she has haste. Just generally, gaining this effect as soon as possible is pretty great. Time Moratorium is the effect that these IDs provide that is most beneficial damage-wise, but it can slow you down if you use it improperly during the encounter. It prevents the enemy from taking damage. Instead, it stores all damage taken and deals it all as sloth damage at the end of the next turn, with as much as a 30% damage boost, as well as triggering Tremor Burst once. The damage can also trigger early by attempting to inflict Time Moratorium to an enemy that already has it. It's a very powerful effect that feels great when fighting bosses, but is typically pretty bad in fights with a lot of smaller enemies. Regardless, massive bursts of elemental damage is kind of the game plan of Tremor nowadays, and this ID is solid enough to be worth bringing in order to utilize it. This ID is actually incredible for fueling Outis' ego, effectively perfectly fueling an ego in every slot that the ID can make good use of. 2 Pathos Mathos is very cheap, clashes as good as her skill 3, and provides a passive damage bonus through its passive that is always usable. Yasineta Tedrupam is an ego that wants to be used by a fast ID since it provides same turn attack power up to allies, and since borrowed time gives a lot of haste, that's no issue for this ID. It also inflicts Lust Fragility in a team archetype with a decent amount of Lust skills, and is always SP positive since it heals her own SP after using it. Holiday Burst Tremor heals the SP of a bunch of allies so it's good for support, and can apply sloth damage up to a good amount of allies if you time your resonance well, and the passive can sometimes randomly apply Tremor to enemies when giving buffs to allies, so it combos well with Yasinata Tedrupam. And Binds is an easy way to trigger Tremor Burst on all enemies, as well as converting the Tremor to Fracture, making attacks far more powerful if the target is staggered. It also provides great passive resource generation through its passive. It's rare to have an ID that fuels their ego this well, so this fact by itself makes her a very noteworthy ID even compared to her competition in Molar Outis. Speaking of Molar Outis, this ID feels like a proper side grade to Molar Outis in the same archetype rather than outright replacing her. Usually, when a Sinner gets a second ID for the same archetype, the new ID is always stronger. However, Molar Outis' access to discard for skill consistency, as well as her higher average damage on skills 2 and 3, means that both are great choices for a Tremor team if you want to use them. Next up, we have Crushbound past Meursault, a brand new VAV ego that deals ridiculously high damage and is far better than Yearning Merkala for general use. The Awakening is a 4-20 rolling blunt sloth ego with 4 coins and 6 attack weight that can gain up to 3 attack weight based on the main target's sum of tremor potency and count. It inflicts a small amount of tremor potency to all of its targets, as well as healing HP after use, then also refunds its entire SP cost if you trigger an even-numbered sloth resonance on an even-numbered turn, or an odd-numbered sloth resonance on an odd-numbered turn. This is the style of ego that gradually loses SP over time, so the refunding effect is pretty nice to activate. This ego inflicts a lot of tremor count on the first coin. More interestingly, if the main target has a tremor amplitude, it will trigger amplitude entanglement on all targets to match the amplitude of the main target. This can be incredibly helpful for dealing a lot more damage with subsequent coins, which can deal more damage based on the main target's tremor values. Additionally, the final coin can trigger additional tremor bursts based on how much damage is being increased by its own effect. The entanglement effect is going to be pretty situational, but it does provide an interesting niche at least. The passive grants 1 damage up on odd-numbered turns and 1 protection on even-numbered turns. It's a pretty whatever passive, but after using it the first time, you also gain 1 accumulated past, an effect which increases by 1 every turn. On top of being the value that affects how much the ego heals, it also grants 1 clash power up and 1 offense level up for every 3 value, meaning it can be as much as 5 clash power up total, though it will take some time to get up that high. That said, it is a very valuable passive effect to have on an ego that's this powerful. It also continues Meursault's trend of having a bunch of ego that grant great passive bonuses to himself after their use. The Corrosion is a 30 to 20 rolling blunt sloth ego with a single coin and 7 attack weight that can gain 2 attack weight if the main target has 3 or more tremor potency plus count. It gains a lot of extra damage based on the highest resonance, as well as gaining a minuscule additional amount of extra damage if you match the oddness or evenness of the turn with your sloth resonance, and heals a little bit more HP than the Awakening does. It triggers an additional tremor burst on default, and still bursts 2 extra times if the damage boost from the target having tremor is high enough. It has the same entanglement effect as the Awakening, but honestly the high expense kinda makes it not worth it anyways. On top of that, even though its damage conditionals reach a much higher percentage, meaning its damage can actually outdo that of the Awakening, losing 3 coins means the Awakening will still usually deal more damage consistently than it, once you take into account any other effects outside of the ego that Meursault currently has. It's just not a very useful corrosion due to its insanely high cost. There are 3 Meursault IDs that fuel at least 3 of the resources needed for this ego in the Thumb Capo Meursault, Middle Little Brother Meursault, and Liu South Meursault. Of these, the best is definitely Thumb Capo, who has the negative effects of their overheat status completely negated by the positive effects of accumulated time once it ramps up. Realistically though, a lot of Meursault's IDs gain a good amount of use from this ego, and outside of bleed teams, it will always be the best option for him to take in a Bob slot with its ridiculously high damage and generalist passive. The additional clash power also helps IDs like Rose Spanner Meursault and LCB Sinner Meursault become quite a bit more reliable when paired alongside Regret, making them usable Tremor IDs that don't require a high investment to obtain. Tremor teams rely very heavily on their special amplitudes to deal more damage, with the most popular and effective being Reverb and Scorch, with Decay and Fracture being less popular but still decently effective. First things first, Yuridivya Ryoshu is great to put on the bench if you intend to put the new Outis in the first team slot, since her support passive increases tremor count gained from the first deployed ally, and T-Corp Outis' tremor gain is not fantastic on her own. If you want to take advantage of Tremor Reverb, Yuridivya Honglu is a must to bring along with his Cavernous Wailing ego, especially since Reverb combos well with Time Moratorium. And speaking of Time Moratorium, the other 2 T-Corp IDs allow you to more consistently activate it in order to potentially utilize it more often. If I had to guess, Rodian's T-Corp ID is strangely a better pair for the new ID and ego due to her Sin affinities and better ability to inflict Bind, as well as her access to better ego for Tremor teams than Don Quixote has, and Don doesn't have the luxury of not overriding enemy amplitudes with Tremor Chain like Outis does. Regret Faust is also great for damage in Tremor teams since her passive allows the whole team to inflict additional defense level down for more damage, and she inflicts some very powerful debuffs. Access to Everlasting also helps to trigger much more damage on turns you intend to trigger a lot of Tremor bursts for, extra Reverb and or Scorch damage. Heisho Faust is also great in Tremor teams since you can basically guarantee that she will move first on turns you intend to use Everlasting on the target, even with Outis being pretty fast under borrowed time. Tremor Scorch teams necessitate bringing both Thumb IDs on Sinclair and Meursault, and Meursault's new ego means you will pretty much always want him in a Tremor team anyways. They are both fantastic for damage and trigger a lot of Tremor bursts as well. Tremor Scorch teams also mean that Burn teams get great use of the new ego as well. As a result, a variety of Burn IDs are good pairings with it, such as Ardor Blossom Star Faust, Liu Yisang, Liu Rodian, Liu Ishmael, and Fire Fist Gregor. Zwei Ishmael is also great for Tremor teams since she is insanely bulky while also providing Sin affinities that are rare on a Tremor team. Her lack of a sloth skill is excellently covered by her Christmas Nightmare ego, that is also great for damage since it triggers multiple Tremor bursts and has multiple coins. And while he is more of a backup strategy due to relying on Tremor Decay, Elfie Heathcliff is actually a pretty solid damage dealer for a Tremor team. His access to asymmetrical inertia gives him access to a sloth skill that is easy to fuel, and the passive works like that of Regret Faust to inflict 1 fragile per target every turn for extra additional damage. And that's about all the time I can give to this new target extraction. It's actually a really solid banner to pull on, though I imagine most players won't have the funds to do so, since Walpurgisnacht was last week, so feel free to borrow them from my company if you want to try them out before starting them next week. Let me know what you think about them in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe as it helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching my video, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you again soon.